Hello, everyone. Welcome to Speak to Me in English. Remember, my name is Alex. I am your host for this podcast. And for today's episode, I'm very happy because today we have a very, very special guest. She's a very good friend of mine. She has helped me a lot, also practicing my own English. And she is Rachel. And as I mentioned, she's a very good friend of mine. She's from United States. And before giving you more information about her, I would like that she introduces herself to you, to the audience, so she can tell us a little more about herself. So, Rachel, good morning, Rachel. How are you today?
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm doing great. Hello to everyone listening. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I am from San Antonio, Texas. My dad is from the United States and my mom's from Mexico. So I grew up speaking both Spanish and English, but for a long time, English became the predominant language I would speak, just because, we spoke it everywhere, school, just with friends. And so, I reconnected with Alex, or just connected with him to practice some of my Spanish, and he practices English, and that's how our friendship started. So yeah, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, Alex.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And yeah, so well, in this case, as you mentioned, you also speak Spanish, and you are also like taking some classes, learning more about the language. So I think that
Yes.
we have some things in common when it talks about like this process of learning a new language or trying to master a new language. And in this case, I already asked you some of the questions that we're going to check today. We talked about them before, but I think that it's important that people hear like this information from an American speaker, or in this case, from a native speaker, because in Mexico, usually finding someone from the US or finding a native speaker to learn English is it's something very, very important. So I would like to hear like your thoughts about some things that are very common for, especially for Mexican people. But to begin with the first question, for example, Mexico and the United States are very close, and normally because of movies, or normally because of the history of both countries. At least people in Mexico, yeah, I think that in many other countries in Latin America, normally we see the United States as a very great place to live in, a place with a great education system. We also consider this as a very good option to learn English. So, what do you think about it? Do you think that all these ideas are correct? Do you have another point of view?
That is a very great question. So, I think there is a good educational system in the United States. Maybe in the movies it's represented as like better than it really is in real life. And I think a lot of it depends really on where you live, which state you live, because each state has like different educational systems. And then um, it also depends on like the area that you live. So, for example, if you live in a richer area, more well off, like you're going to have better schools in general. I mean, if you're talking about children, but also universities are going to be kind of in just different areas. So like there's different levels of university. There's like community college, there's like state universities, public universities, and then private universities and Ivy Leagues, right? So you've got a lot of different levels of just schooling and quality of education. Sadly, Texas is known for, at least for the public school system, as having like one of the worst educational systems in the country. So that's interesting. But I mean, I do feel like I learned a lot growing up. So I think it's definitely got a lot of benefits, but yeah, it's maybe not as perfect as it's made out to be, in movies. As for learning English in the United States, I do think it's a very good place to learn English. And I think it's because there's a lot of people in the United States who only speak English. For example, if you went to Europe, I feel like there are people who speak multiple languages, right? They speak maybe the dominant language of the country, but then like other languages from other countries in Europe. And so, probably like immigrants could go to another country and find people who speak the same language as them. Well, here, yeah, a lot of people just speak English. It's not very traditional to learn a lot like another language like it is in Europe. And so I feel like just like you're forced, like in a lot of cases, like if you move to the United States, you're just forced to learn it in order to survive. Um, it isn't the case everywhere. I will say that my abuelita, who lives in Houston, Texas, she doesn't know English. She's lived here for like 35 years, and she's never learned English because she like moved into an area that's just very like Latino concentrated, and so she does everything in Spanish because there are communities where there's a lot of like Latino immigrants, or in other places of the country like Chinese or Asian immigrants, where I'm sure that you could kind of stay within your own native language, right, and not have to learn English. But in general, I think in most places in the United States, you would just kind of have that necessity of learning it, and everyone would be talking to you in it all the time. So I think that helps as well, right? You'd be like getting that input constantly. And then as for like the public school systems, there's like a lot of programs for, like, for example, immigrant children or people who are learning English as a second language to learn like at school. There's like programs where they'll maybe take them out of their normal classes and have like concentrated lessons in English until they can speak it at a higher level and have like all of their classes in English. And then also a lot of universities have like ESL programs as well for like foreign students. So I mean, I think, yeah, there are a lot of programs in public school for children and at higher education to learn English. So I'd say yes, it is a good place to learn.
Yeah, okay. And well, I would like to talk a little more about some things that you mentioned. For example, and nowadays it is believed that because of like this high number of immigrants living in the U.S., especially immigrants from Latin America, and you know that in Latin America, most of the countries are Spanish-speaking countries.
Yeah.
Many people say like, okay, I will go to the U.S. and it's not really necessary to speak English because there are many Spanish speakers. So I think it's not really necessary to know the language. But you mentioned that there are some places in which maybe you can survive without speaking English, but like in most of the places, you really need to speak the language, right?
Yes, I definitely agree. So I think in Texas, you will find, and California probably, you will find more places where there are very strong Hispanic communities. And yeah, you maybe don't ever have to learn the language. But for example, I lived in Utah for 6 years. And I mean, there were some people who spoke Spanish, but a lot of people didn't. Like, you really, I think, did have to learn English if you wanted to, like, try to function well in that area. I think a lot of like this in the center of the country too. I think it's just very, I mean, the I know there are like immigrants all across the United States, but I feel like the communities aren't as like strong and concentrated like in the middle of the country as well, like the Midwest. And so yeah, I feel like there's definitely areas where it would be very difficult not to speak English. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah, and also talking about like education, you mentioned that you have like public schools and public universities and private universities. And I remember that when we talked about this, I was like really surprised because, for example, here in Mexico, public universities, like the principal characteristic is that they are cheap. You need to pay maybe like 5 or 6 thousand pesos a year, and maybe in private schools you need to pay the same amount, maybe 5, 6 thousands, but per month. So the difference is really high in the cost of public education and private education. But I remember that you told me that in the US, like even public education is not really cheap, right?
It's not, no. And that is a difficult part of obtaining higher education in the United States, is that it's all expensive. I mean, the most affordable colleges are, yeah, they're community colleges, but you could be looking at, I don't know, 5,000 minimum a semester, $5,000. That's cheap. I mean, probably more like 7,000. Now, if you're like looking at like state universities that are maybe a little bit better, you're going to be like at 10,000, 13,000, 15,000. And then if you go to really prestigious universities, it's going to be at least 20,000 a semester, which is just ridiculous.
Yes.
But yeah, so a lot of Americans have a lot of student debt for going to college. It's really interesting. A lot of people are like, I mean, they obviously are like unhappy with the system, and they think it's really a business, right? Like instead of higher education being for the people so that, we can better our society and just have, higher trained people for different jobs, it's more like they're trying to, just make as much money as possible off of United States citizens who are just socially and culturally expected to go to these colleges, and also can't get a lot of higher paying jobs without going to colleges. So it's become a big point of discussion, definitely in the United States, is just how expensive higher education is.
Sometimes in movies I see like, especially when we see movies about like young people, like when they need to go to the university, I remember that I see that when they talk about like getting a scholarship, like parents talking about saving money for a long time.
Yeah,
And I thought it was like something more like about like just like the culture or something just to save money. But
no.
now talking to you, I see that it's more like a necessity to have the
Yes,
chance to go to college, right?
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting in a lot of cases. I mean, if parents are like well off, if they're established, like they'll help their kids pay a lot, or some people pay all their child's education, which is, I mean, that's really nice. But in a lot of cases, like in my case, I mean, my parents did help me some when I was just totally broke. Like I had a job, but it was hard because it paid very little. I mean,
Mhm.
especially compared to what I was paying in rent and food plus tuition. And I had some scholarships, and even then, like I didn't, have enough to get by sometimes. So they would help me, but I also worked a lot, to try to pay for it, and I have student debt still, so it's
Yes.
it's a, it's difficult.
Okay. Okay. You see. And can you tell us a little more about your degree? What did you study at the
Yes.
school?
So I studied English, and when I say that, a lot of people are like, "Oh, so you're like really good at grammar, and you're
Mhm.
going to be an English teacher, like teaching, like I don't know, kids
Uh-huh.
at public school." And I'm like, "That's not exactly it." So it was more focused on English literature, just like any literature written in English, in the United States, in England, a lot like British literature, and then it also focused a lot on writing, like writing skills, like professional writing skills, persuasive writing, writing essays like on literature. That was a big part, like literary analysis. And I also took some creative writing classes, a lot of poetry writing classes, because I love poetry. So it was more like on the literary, like writing end of it, not so
Uh-huh.
much like let's break down the English language about, pronunciation, grammar. That's more like English as a second language. Or there was also an English teaching major, but yeah, so it was English, but it was like literature and writing was the main focus.
Something that it's a little different also like in like when we were talking about like the degrees is, for example, like in Spanish, normally when you go to the university, the degree that you obtain, I think this word, well, in Spanish we say that you are a licenciado, like, and some people try to translate this as a license in English. But I remember that you told me that you don't have like that kind of like like names in English, right? It's
Yeah,
different.
no. Yeah, you're totally right. So there are titles in English, but it's usually if you get a doctorate, then you are a doctor, But before that, it's like your education. I mean, it doesn't distinguish you socially, There's not, yeah, any kind of version of licenciado. It's just once you become a doctor. Um, I mean, I think that is the most common title. I'm trying to think if there's another one. Yeah, and that means like any kind of doctorate program, right? It doesn't mean that you're a medical doctor, but like you could be a doctor of English literature, a doctor of sociology, a doctor of architecture, like whatever. But yeah, any kind of education lesson that does not get a title.
I think that's something important to consider at the moment of, especially when people change their CVs from Spanish to English.
Yes.
That's the first problem, like to decide how to do that, because in Spanish it's very important that you write an engineer or maybe like a doctor or maybe like professor, teacher, like that
Yeah.
part is like very important, at least in Mexico. Like when you are describing your profession, like that part is very important. But in English, basically, just say like just if you're a doctor, basically that's like the only profession that usually you write, the only title that you write before your name, right?
Yeah, and professor, you mentioned professor,
Profession.
but the only professors are, you can only call someone a professor if they've gotten a doctorate. So it's not like if someone has a bachelor's or a master's in something, they can't be called professors. I mean, yeah, if you did it, people probably get mad. I don't know. They're very like um just like strict about that here. I don't know why. But I mean, it is a lot of education, and I guess they're like you have to earn it. But yeah, so professor and doctor are like the only titles we have here. Yeah.
Continuing talking about like about this part of learning English. Also something that it's very important for maybe I don't know if like for all the people, but at least what I have seen here in Mexico is that sometimes when people decide to study English and they go to a language center, sometimes one of the first questions that the people ask is, are your teacher Americans? Are your teacher native speakers? It's like something very important to have like an American person as a teacher. And do you think that it's really essential? Do we need like to pay so much attention to this point of having a native teacher, or we can learn also from non-native teachers, non-native speakers?
That's a very good question. I think you can definitely learn from both. And I
Mhm.
think you can learn from non-native speakers. Like if they speak English well, like I think they have a lot to teach you and a lot to offer. I mean, maybe you'll get to a point where like you've learned so much from them, maybe as much as they know. And there
Mhm.
might be some things out of their expertise, right? There might be idioms, like which are dichos in Spanish. They're sayings that they might not be familiar with, or maybe some, words here and there. Maybe more advanced grammatical concepts that they're not familiar
Mhm.
with, but up until the point that they know that they're familiar with, I think they have a lot to teach students. Now, yeah, the advantage of a native speaker is that they probably know, like, they have all of their
Mhm.
native knowledge to offer you, whereas non-native speakers might be lacking in some areas, but I think you can really learn from both. Um, one point that might be helpful with a native speaker is pronunciation, which it depends on your teacher, right? Like if
Uh-huh.
they're a non-native speaker and like maybe they don't have the same pronunciation as a native speaker, right? And if you're really looking to get that native pronunciation, it might be hard to get that from your non-native speaker that doesn't
Mhm.
have, that the same pronunciation. But even then, I mean, you can learn a lot about English itself, the grammar, the different structures, vocabulary. I mean, I think there's a lot you could learn from both. So that's my take on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and for example, now that you are studying a little of Spanish, have you had like native Spanish teachers or non-native Spanish teachers? Have you had both?
That's a good question. So I've been taking classes online, which is not my favorite mode of taking
Mhm.
classes. I hope to be able to take classes in person soon. But the first semester, I did have a native Spanish speaker. She was from La Ciudad de Mexico, but the way the class was formatted, she was only like grading the homework. She never actually gave us classes. It was like
Uh-huh.
asynchronous, which means that you were just working on your homework and the exams on your own, and then she goes in and grades stuff. The second semester I took, I had a teacher and we did have, classes over Zoom, but he wasn't a native Spanish speaker.
Uh-huh.
His mother was from Mexico, but it seems like he didn't speak it growing up or something, but he had studied at Harvard, is what he told
Uh-huh.
us, studied Spanish. But what was kind of interesting to me was that I felt his accent was really strong. Like his gringo accent was pretty strong.
Okay.
I was like, whoa, I'm not like I was kind of surprised. And then and I think it just might be him. I'll talk more about this later, but with him, it also seemed like he had a hard time like speaking Spanish the
Mhm.
whole way through the class. Like he would switch into English a lot, and I was like, whoa! Like I was wanting to get this experience of immersion, of just speaking Spanish for a few hours, and he was kind of switching back and forth. So it seems like he just wasn't very maybe confident or comfortable with speaking Spanish fluidly for an extended period of time, which was hard for me because I am comfortable with that, right? And I was kind of looking for that from a teacher, a professor. So yeah, I think that was not for me the greatest experience working with him as a non-native speaker. But I will say that my husband took some Spanish classes in his undergrad, and most of his teachers were non-native speakers, but they spoke it so well. They spoke Spanish so well. I mean, they taught like Don Quixote, you know, in his
Oh
classes,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and they, you know, which is a very advanced piece of literature, and they would, you know, like analyze it in depth, and they had the vocabulary for it, and they would speak Spanish the whole time. He took grammar classes, writing classes, and he said, you know, his professors were great, even though they weren't native speakers. So I think it does depend to, you know, obviously on the professor you get. But yeah, those have been my experiences with my Spanish classes.
As you mentioned, so I think at the end it depends a lot on each specific teacher. I think it's not
Yeah,
like that we cannot say that all native teachers are the same and not all native teachers are the same. But for example, something that I mentioned is that we have to be careful when we say a native teacher, because saying that a person is a native English teacher or a native Spanish teacher is not the same that saying that the person is a native speaker of English or Spanish, because sometimes we can have a friend or maybe a neighbor who's a native speaker, but that doesn't mean that he's like really good at grammar or like this kind of
exactly.
information, right?
Totally. I totally agree with that. Like you said, just because you are a native speaker of that language doesn't mean that you're qualified to teach that language to other people. And it just makes me think of how many people I know. It's very common in the United States. People will be like, "I can't English today," and what that
Really?
means is like they have a hard time speaking sometimes. I mean, speaking English, and it might be that they like mess up on the pronunciation, or like their grammar is wrong. You know, I think that's something that's more common now, is like people will use the wrong like grammar. Like, for example, they will like conjugate something that should be plural as singular,
Uh-huh.
or they'll use the wrong prepositions or the wrong verb tenses and stuff. And this is in their speaking and in their writing. I used to be a writing tutor at my university, so I would see it all the time in people's writing. I was like, whoa, their English grammar is really bad.
Yeah.
So like Alex said, it's like just because someone is a native speaker of that language doesn't mean that they are really prepared or
Uh-huh.
qualified to be teaching that to other people. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and maybe sometimes maybe sometimes we just want to help, but maybe we are not providing the right kind of help,
Yes.
or maybe sometimes even the way we say think it's very important, because for example, maybe like for example, like we have like this expression like taking a taxi, or to take a taxi, like for example, if you learn Spanish from Spain, that expression is very
Yeah,
different than if you learn it like in the Mexican Spanish. So,
totally.
and for example, like if you're learning, maybe like if you have like the expression from Spain, and I as a Mexican person, I tell you, hey Rachel, be careful, that expression is not correct. Technically I am making a mistake, because the expression is correct, but it's not the common expression in Mexico, in the
Right.
country. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's important also, maybe like, to be careful how we say things to people, right?
No, definitely. I feel like that's happened to me a lot. Like sometimes, I mean, because I do try to learn, you know, as much of like the Mexican Spanish, you know, just the vocabulary and sayings and stuff. But sometimes, yeah, I read books or I watch shows from like other parts of either from Spain or other parts of Latin America, and I learn things and then I say them, and my family, like my mom or abuelita, are like, "What is that? Like, no, that's not how you say it." I'm like, "But I heard it. Like, I know, like, you know, somewhere people say
Uh-huh.
it like that." So it is interesting. I feel like that happens more probably often in Spanish because there are so many Spanish speaking countries and
Uh-huh.
Spanish varies so much from country to
Uh-huh.
country. Whereas English, I mean there are more, I mean, right, United States, England, there's Australia, New Zealand, and I know there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of other places that I'm missing. But maybe not so quite as many countries that
Uh-huh.
speak English as the ones that speak Spanish. So probably not as much variation there.